Welcome to the National Security Alert, brought to you by the Citizens Commission on National Security. Now here's your host, Roger Aronoff.
Thank you, and welcome to the National Security Alert. We are part of the Citizens Commission on National Security, which started out as the Citizens Commission on Benghazi. You can see all of our work at ccnationalsecurity.org. And each week we tackle issues that really are affecting America's national security, which in many ways seems to be hanging by a thread these days. And one of the issues that I want to talk about, and this is what we're going to discuss today, is the issue of climate change, which you hear from many in the media and in the Biden administration and even the Pentagon, that this is an existential threat, man-made global warming, or man-made, now they call it climate change. And the question is it really an existential threat? And is there anything that we could do about it if true? Or is this largely a way to gain control, to control the population, to make political and economic decisions for our society? First, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how recent media coverage has been on this issue.
From scorching heat waves to heavy flooding, extreme weather events have caused widespread upheaval, with thousands of people killed and millions more displaced. Scientists say much of this is what's expected from climate change. A team of researchers recently published a study in the journal Environmental Research, Climate. It looks at the role climate change has played in individual weather events over the past 2 decades. Here are its main findings. It's highly probable that climate change is making heat waves worse. Scientists have had a harder time figuring out how climate change affects drought. Heat waves and drought conditions are also worsening wildfires. The April fires in the US state of New Mexico burned 341,000 acres of land. Episodes of extreme flooding and heavy rainfall are becoming more common and more intense. That's because warmer air holds more moisture. Storm clouds are then heavier when they eventually break.
Thank you. And there's another example, a recent one from MSNBC I want you to see.
Doctor, these temperatures are insane, and frankly, we aren't built for them. We aren't built for the impact if they keep getting worse. After years of you and your colleagues warning about climate change, what's your message now, today?
The message is that this is what we anticipated. It's exactly what we saw coming, and there hasn't been a more urgent time to act than now.
So my guest today is someone who I consider the person best able to take on these issues and questions, whether the politics, the science, not a scientist, but he understands it, the media aspect of it, and what's really behind this effort to convince us all that the world is coming to an end because of our use of fossil fuels. My guest today is Marc Morano. And Marc is the executive director of the Climate Depot. It's climatedepot.com, and I consider it the main and the best repository of all the information that basically debunks this and takes a look at it. It has all the scientists who used to be believers in the global warming catastrophe scenarios and who have switched and become skeptics. He has just incredible stuff. And Marc has become, he's a best-selling author. He's got a new book coming out next month called The Great Reset. We're going to get into that as well. And I just want to say that Marc is a friend. We've worked together on TV shows over 20 years ago and have stayed friends through the years. And I love having him as a guest. He's just incredible, funny, and full of great information. Marc, welcome to the National Security Alert.
Thank you, Roger. I'm happy to be here. Yes, we're old friends, go back to the 1990s, back to the Clinton era. And it's good to be back on your show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Thank you for all that. And my book does come out next month, which sort of gives you the whole agenda behind not just climate, but COVID. But let's start. If I can, there's two clips you showed. I mean, they were 100% bull bleep from beginning to end. The first clip talking about the weather, the high probability that, you know, that scientists say that the droughts and are caused by man-made climate change. First of all, the wildfires and droughts that they reference are declining on climate timescales of 50 to 100 years. So as carbon dioxide has gone up in the atmosphere, extreme weather has declined, and that includes hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, floods, droughts, every aspect, even heat waves. Now, you saw the other one when they talked about the second clip, I guess, referenced heat waves. Biden's own EPA has a 1930s heat wave chart up that shows the heat waves blowing away anything that we've experienced before or since. The 1930s, particularly the mid-30s, but the whole decade, has the hottest decade, hottest city records, hottest state records. About 75% of all heat records in U.S. states were set before 1955. This was the era of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma. We have not even come anywhere close to that. But hey, there was a heat wave here, so we had to declare a climate emergency. And the other thing they did in that first clip was they talked about how scientists say they made it more likely or made it worse. They're using climate models which assume all of the bunkum that the United Nations puts into them, and those climate models then say, oh, this storm is X amount worse because of man-made climate change, ignoring the fact that temperatures have been cooling since 2016, and we're on a no-trend temperature, and since 2014, it's been essentially flat, and ignoring the fact that none of those extreme weather events are increasing in any trend. So how could man-made climate change have played a role other than in the fantasy PlayStation climate model world, which is what the media did? It was pure bunkum from beginning to end, both clips you played. I almost wish you would play it one sentence at a time and let me respond to each sentence. And I mean that, every single sentence of both clips. And I could discuss what the con is, what the what grift they're trying to peddle in that sentence.
All right, well, let's do that.
Seriously, play it one sentence at a time.
Don, can you do that? Can we give that a shot?
From scorching heat waves to heavy flooding, extreme weather events have caused widespread upheaval, with thousands of people...
All right, pause. Extreme weather events, floods, as I mentioned, on climate timescale, this was even hidden in United Nations climate reports. There's either no trend or declining trends, and declining trends, particularly on what they're mentioning there, the droughts and the wildfires. So the idea that it's causing upheaval, that's not an actual meaningful statement, because extreme weather has always caused upheaval. And the key is, what's changed in the last 100 years? Not the weather. Well, the weather's always changing, but not in any trend-wise. The only thing that's changed is fossil fuel development, economic growth, which fueled technology, which has resulted in a 99% climate-related death toll drop. 99% drop since 1920. So go ahead, play the tape, roll the videotape.
Extreme weather events have caused widespread upheaval, with thousands of people killed and millions more displaced. Scientists say much of this is what's expected from climate change.
Right, pause. Okay, so people have always been displaced by extreme weather. People have always been killed by it. But as I mentioned, 99% drop and also a lot less displacement. We have everything at our disposal now because of wealth and fossil fuels. And exactly what is expected? Well, what exactly was expected? If someone says, I predict many bad things to come, anything that happens now in the future that's bad or bad weather event, which has happened in eons through the geologic record of the earth, now is, I told you so, we predicted it. A tornado in Tornado Alley, we predicted it. A hurricane in Florida, we predicted it. It's the lowest level propaganda. Go ahead, play the tape. This is fun.
Climate change. A team of researchers recently published a study in the journal Environmental Research, Climate. It looks at the role climate.
Yeah, what there is a team of researchers well funded from either academia, think tank, or the government. looks at the role climate. This is where they get into PlayStation, computer models, and they say this storm would only have been this bad without man's influence, all based on their assumptions, which they plug in. They can get any result they want. So again, this is just pure hokum. If you want to keep playing, go ahead. Let's see what's next.
Played in individual weather events over the past 2 decades. Here are its main findings. It's highly probable that climate change is making heat waves worse. Scientists have...
Okay, in terms of highly probable, is that a scientific word? Yeah, they may have some scientific definition. Of all the things they claim, because the Earth has warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 120 some years, heat waves you would expect would be true. So I will give them this. That one sentence or that one point on heat waves, in an Earth that's warm since the end of the Little Ice Age, so you would expect that, you would expect heat waves would increase. Having said that, you can look around. The recent European heat wave was nothing unusual. And as I mentioned, in the United States, which has the best weather records, the 1930s still reign supreme on heat waves. So let's continue.
Scientists have had a harder time figuring out how climate change affects drought. Heat waves and...
Yeah, that mentions drought, then it goes into wildfires. In peer-reviewed literature, in United Nations report, you could look at a USD agricultural report and show you the radical drop in wildfires in the United States, in the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe over the last 100 years. We have better forest management, we have better response time, and we've learned how to deal with fires. So the idea that wildfires are any kind of measure of man-made climate change, you're dealing with land use, water use, road construction. You're dealing with forestry service practices that allow overgrowth because environmentalists don't want them to clear out any underbrush that then becomes a ticking time bomb. But the bottom line is wildfires are incredibly reduced. I think something on the order of 80% in the last 100 years. And the same with droughts. A study in, I believe, the journal Nature, a few years back, since I believe it was 1940, there was either no trend or slight decline in global droughts. So again, the other thing I mentioned is they mentioned 2 decades. One of the cons they do, and they do this in temperature, you'll see this in the climate, they'll say, since 1970, our city has warmed up X. Why'd they pick 1970? That was one of the coldest periods during the height of the global cooling. They cherry pick a cold point, and then it's warmed since then, and then they talk about how much it's increased. Well, if they'd gone back to the 1930s, they'd be showing a cooling trend. And in fact, the EPA, Biden's EPA was guilty of this. They started a chart in 1960 and said, look at how much heat waves have increased. And then buried in their website, you can go back to the 1930s. It shows the 1930s up here, and then it drops, and then a slight uptick since 1960. And all they focused on was 1960. This is pure statistical, I guess you'd call it deception, statistical deception. So go ahead if you want to keep playing.
Heat waves and drought conditions are also worsening wildfires. The April fires in the US state of New Mexico burned 341,000 acres of land.
Real quick. Okay, there's another example. The wildfires in New Mexico burned 340,000 acres. It's a statistic without any context. Obviously, if wildfires were much, much worse 50 to 100 years ago, those numbers would be through the roof. But people don't know that. There's no, it's just like, it's like, oh, you know, it's like a 500-pound man saying, I lost 42 pounds, and you're supposed to be impressed or whatever the number is. It doesn't mean anything without context. And that's where that's the real sleight of hand, as the magic trick, the deception. They'll just mention sort of facts that are facts, but they have no context or relevance. What's the history of New Mexico wildfires? Notice she didn't say record breaking. She just said the wildfires burned this many acres. Just sounds scary.
Episodes of extreme flooding and heavy rainfall are becoming more common and more intense. That's because...
Again, I don't know what she said, more common and more intense. I'm not sure what time scale she's going on there. You can always find a trend on 5, 10, even up to 20 years. But if you're looking at climate time scales, 30 to 50 to 100, peer-reviewed literature does not support that claim. And she also might be talking about a region. The other thing they do is say, California has never seen this. This is unprecedented. Well, there's always going to be a record-breaking event somewhere around the world. One of the things I do is, as I compare this to the lottery or a casino slot machine winner, if you look at the casino literature and they show you, look at this person won 10,000 at the slots, this person won 15,000. They put up a wall of people with the big cardboard checks. Look at all these winners. If you looked at it, you would get the impression that everyone's a winner. My gosh, look at all these people. I could be rich. I need to play slot machines at a casino. Same thing true with the lottery. I need to play the lottery. Look at all these winners. It's true that if you play the lottery, if someone plays the lottery, your odds of winning are very low, but the odds of someone winning the lottery are very high. So the odds of an extreme weather event somewhere around the world are very high. The odds of it happening over and over in the same place are very low. But what they do is it's almost like the finger of CO2. Oh, there's a heat wave in Australia. There's a hurricane here. This is record. So they just dart all around the globe claiming to find some record as though it's a trend. But as we both know, if you're in a casino and you're winning a slot machine, just because someone won a $10,000 slot machine doesn't mean winning at the slot machines is a common thing or a trend. And that's exactly what the news media, they have it honed to a science. They did the exact same thing at COVID as well.
Warmer air holds more moisture. Storm clouds are then heavier when they eventually break.
Yeah, this is another one. That's the global warming theory. Air holds more water, storm clouds break. Well, if that's the case, how can we have simultaneously expect more floods and expect more droughts? The idea is it's just whatever happens. In my PowerPoint presentation, I go through all of the opposite predictions. Global warming will cause more fog, less fog. Global warming will cause more snow, less snow. Global warming will cause more hurricanes, less hurricanes. Global warming will cause more ice in the Arctic, more ice in Antarctica, less ice. I mean, literally, I go through dozens and dozens of examples of mainline predictions, and they're all predicting both sides. So no matter what happens, it's like if you predict both teams to win the Super Bowl, you can always say, I predicted it. That's literally how climate science has devolved to.
Look, and even if you accept the notion that unless we go to carbon neutral and get rid of all the fossil fuels,
Yes.
If you accept that there is this global warming going on, how do you distinguish between what part is caused by the sun, by cow flatulence, and on and on. And then plus, what are we, if we do something, but China continues to build coal plant after coal plant, and if it's all supposedly, one world, that is affecting it, how do we ever expect to get to that place? I mean, it's just crazy. And so let's go. You mentioned predictions and how they've been wrong. And we've got Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth. And I know you've taken that apart, but we saw the return of Al Gore this week. And I saw you on Jesse Waters the other night talking about this. And let's play the clip, the relevant clip from Gore on Meet the Press this past weekend.
The climate deniers are really in some ways similar to all of those almost 400 law enforcement officers in Uvalde, Texas, who were waiting outside an unlocked door while the children were being massacred. They heard the screams, they heard the gunshots, and nobody stepped forward.
Now that's one of the most obscene analogies I've ever heard, but coming from him, we could talk about the inaccurate predictions, the hypocrisy. Why don't you give us your riff on Al Gore?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's been literally wrong on every single thing. First of all, he made polar bears the icon in his first movie. And polar bears are disappearing from Al Gore's books and movies because in his sequel book, there was no mention. Why did Al Gore drop polar bears? Because they're at or near historic population highs. They've never counted so many. They're thriving so far in the Arctic. The only place they're endangered is in the government-funded computer models of 100 years from now and the climate researchers, because polar bears are the species have survived much, much warmer temperatures than even the most extreme climate model predictions show you. But Al Gore has done the tipping points in 2006. We have a 10-year window. He said the Arctic would be ice-free. He was wrong on that. He has been spectacularly wrong. So what he's trying to do right now is stay relevant. So he's being provocative. Let's say something outrageous, and he gets attention. His analogy is bleep backwards. And what I mean by that is, it's climate skeptics, it's people who have been fighting against Al Gore and his so-called climate solutions that are pro-life and keeping people alive. If Al Gore had his way, you would have less development. You would have 1 billion people running water and electricity in Africa, slower to get development because of fossil fuel restrictions. You would have economic growth severely hindered as we were forced to deal with more rations and supply chain issues and inflation and degrowth and planned recessions to fight global warming, which is one of the solutions that comes out of the United Nations. So the key with what Al Gore said is it's the exact opposite. Because we've stopped Al Gore, we've continued that trend of a 99% death rate drop of extreme climate-related deaths over the last 100 years, because we've built up the infrastructure, the economy, the wealth, the technology in order to take extreme weather, and we've used fossil fuels to make extreme weather less harmful to humans. So Al Gore is the enemy of the people, not the other way around. Al Gore, his analogy just falls flat on its face and fails.
Well, and he had Current TV, which he sold to the country that owns Al Jazeera, an oil-rich nation,
Yes.
and he made $100 million on that. So he didn't mind that that's basic oil money that he got for his thing.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a point in that. Oprah Winfrey called Al Gore the Noah of our time. And on that same theme, Richard Branson, the CEO of Virgin Airlines, was asked in a live TV interview with Al Gore sitting next to him, is Al Gore a prophet? And Richard Branson paused. This was in Michael Moore's film. Michael Moore actually is with us on this renewable energy. He believes in climate, but he knows about the renewable energy scam. And in the clip, Richard Branson looks at the interviewer and he says, is Al Gore a prophet? Well, it depends on how you spell the word prophet. And then he chuckles and has an awkward pause there with Al Gore. So even Al Gore's friends and allies know that he is a prophet, but not the kind Oprah, not like Noah. He's a prophet in the sense of being a grifter, and that's it. So, Oprah thought he was the prophet like Noah. It turns out he's from the Church of Global Warming Alarmism, not any, at least Noah got his marching orders from God. Gore gets his from the almighty dollar. As you mentioned, by the way, that he was on the world's quest to be the world's first carbon billionaire because Obama's green stimulus funded all the companies Al Gore was either on the board, founded, or benefited directly from. And after that, cap and trade essentially collapsed in the early teens. He sold to Al Jazeera, made a couple $100 million more. So what did he do with all that money? Well, now he's investing and had the largest IPO for the fake meat business, timed to a big UN report that said meat eating has to stop for the sake of the climate. They want to make meat eating rare and expensive, which brings us to modern headlines, Roger. What do you think's going on in Sri Lanka, the Netherlands? What's happening in Canada right now? They're shutting down modern agriculture, high yield agriculture. They're going after meat eating. They're trying to collapse our agricultural and food system the way they successfully have collapsed our energy system to create chaos, to put them in charge, and to force us to eat lab-grown meat, which Al Gore and Bill Gates will benefit in. That's what their biggest business models are, and to get us to eat insects. And that's no joke. The United Nations is pushing insects. Hollywood. Stephen Colbert had on Robert Downey Jr. this week talking about all the insect eating and how great it is and all the protein and how good it is for the planet. The World Economic Forum is all in on eating insects. The World Economic Forum is promoting a 3D printer where you put in this 25 ingredient vegetable oil processed goo that makes up lab-grown meat, and you can do 3D printing of fake meat of several ounces a minute. So say you want a big porterhouse steak for dinner, you just put the goo in this new 3D printer and wait, and it prints out, and you can eat your dinner straight from the printer. This is their vision of our future if we allow it.
Well, this is a good place to introduce your book that's coming out next month, The Great Reset. I mean, we're all hearing a lot about this, but now that you've dug so deeply into it, I want to hear what, about the World Economic Forum, what they have planned for us, and what is behind all this. Tell
well,
us.
The Great Reset. Sure, this is, people say, Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. That's what the Media Matters, the Soros-funded group, labeled me. Well, first of all, 2020 was the year conspiracy realities outnumbered conspiracy theories. That's point one. And number two is it's not a conspiracy theory if there's a book by the World Economic Forum called The Great Reset where they literally lay out the vision. So my book is dissecting their plan and vision, and I go through the history of it. I go through the history of the administrative state, going back to Woodrow Wilson and the whole idea of rule by experts, a technocracy, where there was a vision by Woodrow Wilson and his administration that people, if left essentially to their own devices, would just create a mess. And that proceeds to this day. If we're left to our own devices, the global elite think will create racism, inequity, push white supremacy, will create environmental collapse, will create a climate emergency, that we need to be essentially controlled and regulated and told what we can and can't do on a bureaucratic level that's, you know, not unprecedented in human history, but back to the level of the serfs. So the motto of the Great Reset, as promoted by Klaus Schwab, the founder, who looks like an evil Bond villain, is you will own nothing and you will be happy. Meat will be a rare and expensive treat. You'll have no privacy. You won't mind. Everything you want will be delivered by drone. And you won't essentially need private car ownership. They're pushing for the abolishment of private car ownership. Now, keep in mind, when it says you will own nothing, they don't mean that private property will be abolished. They will own it. You will be a renter. There was a comedian, Jimmy Dore, who did a great spoof with Klaus Schwab, but he hit upon the truth. And the truth is, like, for instance, these Dutch farmers in the Netherlands who are fighting for their lives, generational family-run farms. What happened in the Netherlands? Their president, in the words of Klaus Schwab, we will penetrate the cabinets by the World Economic Forum. Their president, Ruud is his name. Sorry about my imitation there. That's my evil Bond villain, but that's what he sounds like. Their president in the Netherlands is a protege of Klaus Schwab. He went through the Young Leadership Training Program. And so did Justin Trudeau, so did many leaders from Macron and France and others. And so this is coming directly from the World Economic Forum, directly from the EU, this net zero climate goals. So a judge ordered, because the country pledged, that all these farms have to stop using this modern fertilizer, nitrogen, which they said is creating it's more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, which isn't true. And I have on my website scientists refuting that. But essentially, who's this going to affect? The small, independent, family-run farms that have been owned by the same family for decades and generations. They're going to go under. They're the ones that are protesting the loudest and the hardest. Why isn't big agribusiness or others protesting? Because they can absorb the cost. If you want to know how monopolies form, it's because the more regulations you have, the bigger the company that can handle it, and the smaller ones get wiped out. This is how over-regulation of our economy is how we end up with monopolies, whether it's big tech or big agribusiness or big oil or whatever you want to call it. This is why ExxonMobil supports the UN Paris Agreement. This is why ExxonMobil supports carbon taxes. This is why ExxonMobil supports Obamacare, et cetera, on down the line, because they can absorb the cost. They have the best lawyers, the highest paid lobbyists. They can bend the politicians to their will. It's the small companies that get crushed. So back to the Netherlands, these farms are going to go under. And this is what Jimmy Dore was making jokes of. He had a Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum founder, imitator on. And Klaus Schwab was saying, no, they won't have to leave their farms. We will take them in and they can become renters on the land they once owned, because we will buy up this land. And essentially, they're going to convert it to low yield organic, like we saw in Sri Lanka where they overthrew the government, or they want to make sure they have heavy influence. Netherlands, don't discount this. Netherlands is the #1 meat exporter in Europe. So if you want to go after meat eating and promote your lab-grown meat, you would do two things. Support policies with your friends. People like Bill Gates would support policies that crush the meat industry across the world. And how would you have influence on that besides just the policies through the EU, the United Nations, World Health, and the World Economic Forum? You would also do it through land ownership. And a lot of people are worried about China buying up U.S. farmland. There's worry about Chinese farm monopoly. Well, I got good news, Roger. China's not going to have that monopoly. Why? Because Bill Gates is also buying up U.S. farmland, and he's now America's #1 single largest farmland owner. So we have competition. Isn't that great? China, Bill Gates. I'm not sure who I want to win that battle, but I do know this. Bill Gates now has an oversized influence in American agriculture to steer us away from meat eating as America's #1 landowner of farmland. And this is according to NBC News. It's been reported in People magazine. This isn't a conspiracy. Where'd you get that fact from? I probably have over 1,000 footnotes in my book, and I tried to pick only mainstream sources like USA Today, like Time magazine, like New York Times, because I purposely went out of my way to avoid blogs or anything that people didn't recognize, because I want people to realize this is out in the open. They're not hiding this. They've written books, they've had seminars, they do slick videos on this Great Reset. But that's where we are. That's what's happening at the moment. And now Justin Trudeau is following suit. He's going to ban the same kind of fertilizer. Canadian farmers are gearing up. And this is going to give Justin Trudeau, a protege of the World Economic Forum, went through the training, a chance to be the Castro strongman he always wanted to be, because he got to crack down on the truckers and go after the bank accounts of people who made a muffin for the truckers. They would lose their bank account. Now he can go after the farmers and destroy their lives and anyone who supports them. So it's a win-win for big government. They love the power play.
And it's so brazen that they are so out in the open about what they're doing. I mean, how does Bill Gates explain buying up all this farmland?
Okay, good question. He comes out and he says, I think it's, NBC News reported that he has like dozens of shell companies that are buying it. So it's not like called like the Bill Gates Land Corporation. It's a name you would never recognize, never associate with Bill Gates. And Bill Gates says that it's kind of a blind trust and he wasn't even aware of it, and they just make investments and he's not involved. He just says, I don't know anything about it. That's just my blind trust essentially handling all my investments. And just Shazam, somehow I'm America's largest farmland owner. Imagine that. I wasn't even aware of it. Anyway, what do I know? What does he know about monopolies? We can't accuse Bill Gates of trying to start a monopoly on anything, right? That would be wrong.
So what about the complicity? What about the complicity between, say, the Biden administration and the World Economic Forum? I mean, do they share the same goals? Yeah. Are part of the same plan?
They do. In fact, the U.S. version of the Great Reset is Build Back Better. And Joe Biden is in his administration. I can't say Joe Biden because Joe Biden's not really there, but the people behind him and the whole administration. And a lot of it has to do with President Obama. This is really Obama, I would say 2.0, but this is so far advanced from what Obama tried to do with executive orders. What Biden's done, I would call it Obama 3.0, the Biden administration. But essentially, they are doing everything in their power. They started out, all of Biden's advisors were calling for national lockdowns and a ban on interstate travel originally. And then they thought that was just, they couldn't get away with it. But essentially, what Joe Biden's administration has done here is they've had extreme COVID policies. They've kept it going. And they're, with all the supply chain, with all the shutting down of American energy and the doubling down on that, they're collapsing the automobile sector. They're collapsing real estate sector. They're collapsing the food market right now. And they're collapsing the U.S. economy. And if you go back, and this was originally alerted to me, by Devoy Murdoch, who did the research, and I looked it up. But if you go back to Tsarist Russia, one of the slogans of Vladimir Lenin, the revolutionary trying to do the Bolshevik revolution, was the worse the better in your society when you're fomenting radical change. Worse is better, or the worse the better. Those are the two things. And I cite historical reference. I think it was Atlantic Magazine and historian. So these are actually attributed to Lenin. So I think the Biden administration is actually taking up that cause. The worse they make it, the better, because the more chaos means the more government control, the more voters that are dependent on government aid, the more you can expand universal basic income, which, if you go back, Roger, in 1972, Hubert Humphrey opposed this when George McGovern announced he was supporting universal basic income. Even fellow Democrats like Hubert Humphrey couldn't support it. Richard Nixon hammered him. McGovern lost in one of the biggest landslides in U.S. history. Fast forward, now we have even presidents like Donald Trump supporting a form of that through this endless COVID relief. In other words, government shuts down the economy, but don't worry, because government will pay you to be happy while the government shut down. It sounds an awful lot like the Great Reset. I'm not saying Donald Trump was involved in that. Donald Trump was duped by the public health establishment. And I believe one of the greatest blunders Donald Trump made, and any president made in the last 50 years, was on March 13th, 2020, when Donald Trump signed that public health threat emergency with the urging of Birx and Fauci and the public health and the world health, Donald Trump enabled every blue state governor to become a dictator overnight. They could cancel weddings, funerals, curfews, stay-at-home orders, close churches. But hey, Walmart got to stay open, and big chains and small mom and pop restaurants decimated in big cities. Hey, who cares? Because corporate America benefited. Big tech was booming. All the Democratic donors did well. This is what was born from that. So what COVID was the game changer for the Great Reset, because it accelerated all of these authoritarian trends and then stripped away our freedom overnight. And we know that every single climate activist, from Jane Fonda, who said COVID was God's gift to the left, to John Kerry, who said the parallels between COVID and climate are screaming at us, to Greta Thunberg, who praised the actions of COVID and said now it's climate's turn. We had activists, essentially Jamie Margolis and Vogue, Teen Vogue magazine said, if we can shut down the world for a virus, we can do the same for climate, which is exactly what they've been calling for at these UN summits I've been attending. Planned recessions to fight global warming, limited air travel, a declared climate emergency. You can't fly unless it's morally justified. In other words, you might be able to fly to a funeral, but you can't fly for a vacation because the planet can't handle it. None of these rules would apply to private jets, by the way. Private jet owners would be exempt. This is for the masses. You and I, Roger, we're the masses. If you can't afford a private jet, then this is your future, where vacations are only going to be something the wealthy, your seaside vacation is something only the wealthy could do, and you're going to be, people aren't going to be allowed to do it. So fast forward, I don't want to go on a filibuster here, but I did work in the Senate. But real quick, Joe Biden is now being urged by Senator Elizabeth Warren, Chuck Schumer, House Democrats to declare a national climate emergency. According to the Washington Post, in July 2022, Biden is very close to declaring it. What would that do? It would immediately give Biden 130 executive powers a la COVID. It would give governors and mayors interpretations of that executive order, emergency, climate emergency, to then ban automobiles in cities, close gas stations, smart meter controls on air conditioning, thermostat controls. We are talking about unprecedented because it's post-COVID. And you say, oh, well, the courts won't allow it. We have a great Supreme Court. It took 2 years for one Trump-appointed judge to stop the completely unconstitutional, illegal mask mandates on planes and trains, federal mask mandate on planes, trains, and buses. So it could take years to undo what Biden would be able to do, energy lockdown and climate lockdown under a climate emergency declaration. He may hold off till after the midterms. Hard to say, but he may also do it before the midterms. We'll see.
So you mentioned, I want to emphasize that you were a senior staff member for the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, working with James Inhofe, and I know you did great work there. Yeah, for Oklahoma. But so this with Biden, let me ask you to connect the dots here, because we're seeing something going on. Day one, of course, he ended the Keystone Pipeline. And then shortly thereafter, limited greatly the drilling on federal lands and offshore. And, you know, we've seen the prices of gas and natural gas skyrocketing to the point where just yesterday, Russia basically announced, and the other thing was the Nord Stream pipeline, where Trump had put sanctions on that. Another thing Trump did well was take us out of the Paris Climate Accord, which Biden put us back in. But so now Russia is empowered to just tell Europe, we're cutting 80% of your fuel, except in certain exceptions. And just the crises around the world, food shortages and people freezing in the winter, all these implications that if we'd have just kept drilling and supplying the world, it would have kept all this pressure off. So connect these dots, and does this tie into the Great Reset?
It does. In my book, you can't talk about any of this without talking of COVID, because what happened was, this is a collusion between the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum and the government of China. Now, keep in mind, China it controls the World Health Organization. Bill Gates is the single largest I think the second biggest donor besides only the US government to the World Health Organization. So why is that important? when the Wuhan flu or the coronavirus first appeared, in the lockdowns in January 2020, we saw the images of people dropping dead in the street in China and then being hammered into their doors, and those people in the hazmat suits. We were told by the World Health, who did I think it was like a 5-day investigation into China. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, other World Health Organization officials all came out and said, if you want to contain this virus, follow what China is doing. We must all do what China is doing. They are amazing. They've got it under control. They're going to have zero COVID. We must all do it. And because of that, that's what led, and now Deborah Birx, the public health advisor to Donald Trump at the time, in 2020, who's now retired, just wrote a book, and she admitted that when they tricked Donald Trump into 15 days to flatten the curve, they knew it was not going to be 15 days. They knew it was going to be months or longer, but they said they wanted to do the 15 days because that would give them 15 days to gin up more fear to keep the 15 days going. And that's where Donald Trump got duped. So because this happened, because the whole world was shut down, that was the first set of the Great Reset. It became a new normal. And that collapsed the U.S. economy, that tanked Donald Trump's reelection, and that also tanked our energy demand, surplus, and supply. So because everything just went into total, just collapsed. Fast forward, Biden comes in, doubles down on all these bad policies. I mean, by the time Trump recovers, he brings in Scott Atlas, but it was too late. I mean, the damage had been done. Trump had set his own defeat by being duped by public health. And I'm kind of unmerciless about Trump when it comes to COVID. I love Trump. I thought he was one of the greatest presidents we had since Reagan. He literally did everything right on climate and energy. He was phenomenal. But on COVID, his stumble was so great, it cost him the presidency, and it cost the U.S., and it cost Americans liberty probably for decades because of that declaration and allowing Fauci et al. To set that narrative. So all that happens. We get to a complete shutdown mode, and everyone starts praising the UK Guardian newspaper. What, this is great. You know, we need multiple years of lockdown. If we can keep these lockdowns going, we can meet the UN Paris Climate Agreement goals. I mean, this is the way they think. Human suffering, lockdowns kill. So what happened was energy demand went, and so all the companies, we lost a lot. Talking about earlier about monopolies, we lost a lot of small energy business in the U.S., small fracking operations. All the mom and pops. Who survives? The big, powerful ones that are most likely to have the corporate boards that are going to bow to the woke agenda. And this is the whole problem, but it's also a great benefit for the Great Reset. You want to get rid of all the small independent operators and only deal with the big corporate retail chains and big business who are going to be beholden to that woke, politically correct mob. So all that being said, Europe was way ahead of us anyway with their Green New Deal energy policies. Same thing happened in Europe, except for Sweden. They collapsed their economies, and they had nothing in terms of backup because they were all reliant on energy. We had the spectacle in 2019 of Boris Johnson, who's become the biggest joke of a politician in our modern era, allowed or endorsed pouring cement into England's fracking wells as a virtue signal of how they're going to commit themselves to the net zero climate agenda. And he called for a more feminist environmentalism, whatever he meant by that. But it shut off at least 50 years of domestic natural gas production in England alone. Germany, same nonsense. Angela Merkel going to these UN conferences, doubling down. We had the spectacle of Angela Merkel at a UN German chancellor, previous German chancellor, at a UN summit, arguing with the English prime minister. We will keep the Earth's temperature to 1.2 degrees Celsius 120 years from now. And then the other, I will keep it up from 1 degree. They're sitting there arguing as though they can control the Earth's thermostat. It's modern witchcraft. But because of that ideology, they shut down domestic energy, relied on Russia. Biden comes in, he shut down the East Med pipeline from Israel to Eastern Europe, which would have been a huge boon. Now you have Germany, England, France, all beholden to Vladimir Putin. I did an article today, or posted an article today, about Putin has Europe exactly where he wants them. They're on the verge of economic collapse. They're facing massive death tolls this winter for heating. Because remember, cold kills up to 80 times more than heat. The numbers are 10, 20, up to 80. I did a study today I published in the UK. 80 times more people die in cold weather than they do in hot weather. So people are terrified of these energy shortages, all created from the climate agenda, all created from the Green New Deal, all endorsed by the World Economic Forum, because what they ultimately want is less people. They want a more sustainable population, and they want people to essentially be in chaos, to rely and to be in a crisis state. The more emergency declarations, and I go in the book, I go back to the Roman Republic, the descent of the Roman Empire because of emergency declaration, abuse of powers in the Middle Ages, the era of serfdoms, and then Germany, 1933, 12-year abuse of emergency powers. Go to the Patriot Act, the 9/11 emergency abuse of the terrorism emergency powers, COVID emergency. They're waiting now for the climate emergency. By the way, just as a reference point, we're still living under a public health COVID emergency. That March 13th declaration that Donald Trump signed, greatest mistake of any president in 50 years, greatest single mistake, is still in effect. Biden just extended it till October. We're living in a permanent 100-year emergency, and now they want to add to that the climate emergency. That is the Great Reset, because you don't need democracy. When you have Justin Trudeau, Tom Friedman, the New York Times, the UN climate chief, Christina Figueres, Obama's energy officials, you have CNN just recently, all praising one-party authoritarian rule in China, saying this is the way China gets it done. They don't have the messiness of democracy. I think Justin Trudeau used the word he's envious. What lockdowns and emergency declaration give the once free West is a one-party style Chinese rule. You don't need no stinking Congress. You don't need parliament. You don't need city councils. A governor with unelected bureaucrats can just start declaring stuff because we're in an emergency, don't you know? An endless emergency with no criteria in which to end this emergency. That's the Great Reset.
So a couple more things and we'll wrap it up. I could go on for a long time with you, but
I'm exhausted. Go ahead.
So one of the things that the pandemic and COVID changed forever is how elections are run in this country. And of course, 2020 is, been talked about every day since. And now we're getting close to the 2022 elections. And for Biden and company and the Democrats, everyone's predicting a big red wave that the Republicans are going to take over. And if they do, so they would take over the January 6th committee or start a new one, and they would have oversight on all these issues. And it could really expose so much that has gone on here. And I'm wondering how you see this playing out. I mean, people say they can't afford to lose, because if the Republicans gain the subpoena power and all this, that it's going to expose so much more. I mean, the counter to that is that, so what? We already know how corrupt the Bidens are, Hillary, there's no consequences for anyone on the left. If you're on the right, you're going to get visited by FBI at 6 a.m. with CNN tailing behind. So can you put on your political prognosticator hat and tell us what you see coming in 2022 and beyond?
Well, first of all, you hope they're already gearing up. We've seen the return of mask mandates and social distancing in California. Other places are talking about it. So the first thing they could do is try to do another COVID style interruption of elections, where people aren't going to be able to go directly to the polls, liberal mail-in balloting and mail-in balloting. That's point one. I don't see any way they can't do, to the extent of election fraud, they can focus that on key states for electoral college purposes in 2020. When it comes to a midterm, it's much harder to achieve that level of election fraud, because you're dealing with district by district, popular vote all across the country. So I do think the Republicans are set for historic gains on the level of 2010 with the rise of the Tea Party after Obama's first 2 years. What that means, I think you're going to see the quick exit of Anthony Fauci the second any Republicans come in. But the problem I have is Republicans are pretty much a disaster. Mitch McConnell is no foe to the Great Reset. I mean, he is just a bloated old, essentially establishment figure that's not going to fight for anything. You have Kevin McCarthy in the House, minority leader, who supports climate change as a problem, wants Republican solutions, never really spoke up against any of the vax mandates, the lockdown. I mean, this is the Republican leadership that has been pathetic. So you hope that there's such overwhelming numbers and the Republicans can elect new leaders, but it doesn't really happen. If you think back, 2010 brought us the Tea Party. But who was our nominee in 2012? Oh, gee, it was Mitt Romney. So I don't know. I just think the Republican Party is such a bloated, disgusting entity that I get madder at the Republican Party than I do the Democrats. At least the Democrats are honest and you know what you're dealing with. Republicans are just two-faced sellouts and weak. There's a lot of great members. I love Rand Paul. I love Ted Cruz and some great congressmen and Senator Inhofe. But as a whole, the Republican leadership is very weak. So we'll see where this leads. And in terms of president, I think the greatest choice, I don't know if people agree with me or not, is Ron DeSantis, because of all the politicians in our modern age, he's probably the most important politician in our generation for one reason. He alone stood up intellectually and scientifically to the COVID theater madness lockdowns. He stood up to the Faucis, the Birx, the World Health, and he did it with intellect, with peer-reviewed journals, with epidemiologists, renowned ones who brought into Florida. He gave the model for every other Republican governor to push back on all of this madness. And without a Ron DeSantis, I don't know that America would be in half as good a shape as we are now. That's how important he is. And I think he's the guy, I voted for in the CPAC straw poll over Donald Trump. So that's what I think. And I do think that Republicans are set for historic victory. I'm disappointed in Republican leadership. It can only be good if the Republicans win, but that's when Biden's going to get really creative. And I do believe we're almost certainly going to face a national climate emergency, and they're going to have 130 executive powers, the different Defense Production Act, World War II style powers, where they can now shut down more fossil fuels, double down on that. They're going to mandate solar and wind even more without, again, having to consult with democracy. It goes back to that lust for China's one-party system.
So for my final question, I'm going to come back to national security. We are the Citizens Commission on National Security, and I know the Defense Department has stated that the greatest threat to our national security is climate change. I want you to answer that question or answer that assertion that they make and have been making for quite a while now, and then we'll wrap it up. Talk about your books and film.
Yes, and that's actually in my current book, Green Fraud. I go into that the national security threat. It is completely backwards. If you go back through the history of major wars, warfare, European wars and conflict in general, and strife of societies happen during cold times, when bad weather ruins crops, creates shortages, creates chaos, creates unrest, creates conflict, creates war. Center for Strategic International Studies did an analysis of this 7, 8, 9 years ago, showing that the greatest wars have occurred during cold times, and warm times are times of peace. In fact, the medieval warm period from about 900 to 1300 AD was called the medieval climate optimum, because warm temperatures are considered optimum, not cold. So the idea that global warming is driving some kind of national security threat or causing war is nonsense. If you go back to the 1970s, and I do this in my book, Green Fraud, you can see where the CIA is warning of man-made global cooling causing a national security threat. A whole bunch of other media publications and others, it was that same theme. And the idea was actually more valid because a colder time, a coming ice age, would create more conflict, but it's not the other way around. They also blame bad weather, extreme weather on global cooling. So it is nonsense. And this is something that we have generals, I don't know if they're on the pay, but they're spouting such utter trash. We have our Navy now going solar and worried about sustainability. We have our Defense Department. I mean, Biden has transformed our once noble defense agencies into just environmental, Greenpeace workshops of utter nonsense. And I posted all this at Climate Depot. You can read these Navy ships. They brag about solar panels on a Navy cruiser or something. I mean, stuff that you wouldn't even think why is your military spending all this time and attention and funding on that when, you know, they're essentially trying to gin up a hot war with Russia right now, and they're worried about solar panels on their, you know, on fleet.
And one last thing I want to ask you about, because you used to work for Rush Limbaugh. You were his sort of correspondent on all the junk science issues. And Rush left us, died last year, and tremendous loss to the conservative movement and all that. I was wondering if you see anyone who has sort of taken his place as the person.
Wow. No, not any one person. Not at all. I have my favorites. People, I don't know if you know, Chris Plant is hilarious and he does a great job, but I don't know if anyone who's done. Dan Bongino's replaced him here. I haven't heard Buck Sexton. He's not on in the Washington market. Sean Hannity's still going on it. Mark Levin, they're all great. But in terms of like that blend of entertainment, intellect, and politics, I don't know of the person. I don't know that Rush can be replaced, at least not in our generation. It's going to take a while.
Right. Okay. Well, Marc, why don't you tell them about your books, where they can find them, your films? I highly recommend it. You can, you know, the climatedepot.com is the great website where all this is located, but tell them where they can find your books and films, and we'll wrap this up.
Okay, well, the first book was Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. And that's sort of an A to Z on the whole climate issue. The second book was on green fraud, why the Green New Deal is worse than you think. That gets more heavily into the politics and AOC and the more modern Green New Deal. And my most recent book coming out in August 30th is The Great Reset, the permanent lockdown of the global elite. It goes all through how they want to essentially collapse our current system and rebuild it with a global elite in charge, crushing the middle class. And essentially you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. You'll have no privacy and you won't mind. This is their actual stated goal. And they've come a long way since COVID of achieving this, accelerated. I also did the film Climate Hustle 1 in 2016 and Climate Hustle 2 in 2020, with narrated by Kevin Sorbo. And I think that's a great film. We have sections on child propaganda, how kids are indoctrinated from kindergarten through college. We have a section on climate change as a religion. We have a section on the wacky solutions. We have a section on UN Paris. We have a section on Green New Deal. We have a section on renewable energy. We have a section on the science. That is a sort of one-stop shopping, a very entertaining, fun film. Climate Hustle 2, that's our most recent. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, Roger. And I hope I didn't filibuster too much here for you.
No, you're great. ClimateHustle2.com. Isn't that the website for the documentary?
Yes, that's the website. And mine's, yes, ClimateHustle2.com and ClimateDepot.com is my main website.
Right. Climate Hustle, the number 2.
And also there's a new book out.
Go ahead.
There's also a new book out by Jerome Corsi that is just dropped today, actually. It's The Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change. And I wrote the foreword to that, and he dedicated. That's another new book out that sort of wraps this all together, climate and energy. And he goes heavily into the science and heavily into the renewable energy. It's a very good overview of the entire climate energy debate.
Okay, well, listen, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. And I think it's so informative and helpful to so many people while there's so much propaganda going the other way on this. And I so appreciate it. You, Marc, and folks, we're going to sign off for today's show. We'll be back next week with another one, and have a great week.